For much of the past 3 decades, the Beckham family has operated as a case study in how celebrity can be converted into lasting power. What began with the rise of a successful footballer and a pop star developed into a tightly managed enterprise spanning fashion, sport, media, and global branding. David Beckham's career progressed from Manchester United to Real Madrid and beyond, while Victoria Beckham moved from chart-topping success to leading a luxury fashion label. Together, they presented not only personal achievement, but a model of unity, discipline, and consistency that appeared resistant to public pressure. The family itself became central to that structure. From an early age, the Beckham children were visible within the brand, appearing in interviews, documentaries, and social media posts that reinforced the image of a close and supportive household. Brooklyn Beckham, as the eldest, held a particularly symbolic position. His milestones were shared publicly, and his early attempts to establish a career were framed as natural extensions of the family's creative and commercial reach. Photography, cooking, and lifestyle projects were introduced with institutional backing and media access that few young adults possess. This visibility reflected an internal hierarchy. David and Victoria functioned as both parents and decision makers, while their children lived within a system where private life and public presentation often overlapped. Career choices, appearances, and messaging were shaped by a broader logic of brand continuity. Long-standing relationships with media outlets and public relations teams reinforced this structure, ensuring that the family's image remained controlled and coherent. As Brooklyn reached adulthood, that balance began to change. Unlike his parents, whose reputations were built through prolonged competition and scrutiny, Brooklyn's prominence was inherited. In a digital environment that rewards perceived authenticity and criticizes entitlement, this distinction mattered. Online commentary increasingly questioned the substance behind his professional experiments, and the label of Nepo Baby became a recurring theme in public discussion. At the same time, Brooklyn's personal life moved beyond the immediate orbit of his parents. His relationship with Nicola Peltz introduced him to a different form of power and security. The Peltz family's influence operates largely through private capital, legal structures, and long-term investment rather than public visibility. Their position does not depend on constant narrative management or emotional access to the public. Marriage formalized that shift. It joined two families whose approaches to authority differ in fundamental ways. One relies on narrative control, cohesion, and visibility. The other relies on privacy, legal boundaries, and financial insulation. From the outside, this appeared as a union of privilege. Internally, it altered the balance of influence Brooklyn had known since childhood. Publicly, the Beckham family continued to project stability. Appearances at sporting events, fashion launches, and milestone celebrations suggested continuity, yet changes in patterns of interaction became noticeable. Absences from key events and reduced public acknowledgement drew attention in an era where social media functions as a record of affiliation. Silence began to carry meaning. What distinguished this period was a shift in dependence. Brooklyn no longer relied solely on his parents' platforms for access or legitimacy. His personal and professional future increasingly took shape within a separate framework that offered resources without requiring alignment with the family brand. This reduced the authority traditionally exercised by the family's central figures. The situation unfolded alongside a broader cultural trend in which adult children publicly redefined family boundaries. Concepts such as autonomy, emotional safety, and independence are now frequently articulated through legal and therapeutic language. These ideas often sit uneasily with older expectations of loyalty and collective identity, particularly within families whose success has been built on unity. As a result, internal family dynamics became open to competing interpretations. Actions once understood as parental involvement could be read as overreach. Efforts to maintain connection could be perceived as attempts to preserve control. With no single narrative holding, the structure that had long governed the family's public and private life began to loosen. As the balance within the family shifted, points of friction that had previously been managed behind closed doors began to surface in ways that were harder to contain. The first signs did not arrive as direct accusations or public statements, but as inconsistencies. Family gatherings that once appeared routine were suddenly marked by absence. Public milestones were acknowledged selectively. Small gestures, such as social media interactions, drew outsized attention because they departed from long-established patterns. The wedding of Brooklyn Beckham and Nicola Peltz in 2022 became an early focal point for these tensions. At the time, public reporting framed disagreements around logistics and fashion as minor misunderstandings. The absence of a wedding dress designed by Victoria Beckham was treated as a creative scheduling issue, and any suggestion of deeper conflict was largely dismissed as speculation. The official narrative emphasized harmony and mutual respect, supported by carefully chosen photographs and statements. Behind that presentation, however, alternative accounts began to circulate. Brooklyn later described the wedding period as emotionally destabilizing rather than celebratory. He alleged that communication around the dress broke down close to the ceremony, creating stress for Nicola and leaving space for negative interpretations to take hold in the press. He also pointed to the reception itself as a moment when personal boundaries blurred, describing an incident involving the first dance that he said left him embarrassed and sidelined during an event meant to mark the beginning of his marriage. These claims introduced a different reading of the wedding. Instead of a single disagreement, Brooklyn framed the experience as part of a longer pattern in which family hierarchy overrode his autonomy. According to his account, decisions were made with the family's public image in mind, even when those decisions affected his private life. What had once been described as support was reinterpreted as control. Following the wedding, the distance widened rather than closed. Brooklyn and Nicola spent increasing amounts of time in the United States, while contact with the Beckham family became less frequent and more formal. Appearances that might have signaled reconciliation were reportedly conditioned on visibility and documentation. Brooklyn has suggested that invitations to family events often came with expectations of public participation, including photographs and media coverage, which he increasingly resisted. One of the most visible moments came with David Beckham's 50th birthday celebrations. Despite being in the same city, Brooklyn and Nicola did not attend the public event. Reports later indicated that private contact had been sought but not agreed upon under the terms Brooklyn requested. To observers, this absence marked a clear departure from past behavior, where family unity had been consistently prioritized in public settings. During this period, allegations expanded beyond emotional dynamics into legal and professional territory. Brooklyn has claimed that in the lead up to his wedding, he was pressured to formalize agreements concerning the commercial use of his name. He interpreted these discussions as attempts to retain control over his future branding and that of his potential children. While no such agreements were publicly disclosed at the time, the claim reframed earlier career support as part of a broader business strategy rather than parental guidance. Communication between the two sides continued to deteriorate. Brooklyn has stated that interactions increasingly occurred through intermediaries rather than directly, and that informal contact gave way to legal caution. The shift became unmistakable when members of the family were blocked on social media, a move later acknowledged by Brooklyn's younger brother. What might once have been resolved through private conversation had now crossed into formal separation. Throughout this unfolding conflict, David and Victoria Beckham maintained a restrained public posture. Their statements emphasized parental concern and the challenges of raising children in the public eye. References to mistakes and growth were offered without addressing specific allegations. This approach aligned with their long-standing strategy of minimizing engagement with controversy, allowing time and silence to restore balance. Brooklyn, by contrast, began to articulate his perspective more directly. He described persistent anxiety during his years under the family spotlight and framed his distance as a necessary step toward personal stability. He linked his sense of relief to the reduction of performative obligations, suggesting that stepping away from the family structure had improved his mental health. As these narratives developed side by side, they revealed a widening gap in how the same events were understood. Actions interpreted by one side as protection and guidance were experienced by the other as constraint. The lack of a shared framework made reconciliation increasingly complex, as each attempt to clarify seemed to deepen misunderstanding rather than resolve it. By the time legal representation entered the picture, the conflict had moved beyond a family disagreement. It now involved questions of authority, consent, and ownership within a family that had long operated as a unified enterprise. The situation remained unresolved, but the accumulation of allegations and counterpositions made clear that the structure holding the family together was under sustained strain. What remains after the allegations, absences, and legal distance is not a resolved dispute, but a structural break whose implications extend beyond one family. The Beckham situation has moved into a space where reconciliation is no longer simply a matter of emotion, but of governance. A family that functioned for decades as a coordinated brand is now divided along lines of authority, autonomy, and consent, with no clear mechanism for repair. At its core, the conflict raises questions about what happens when parental influence becomes indistinguishable from corporate control. For years, the Beckham model blurred those boundaries successfully. Career support, media access, and family loyalty operated as a single system. That system worked as long as all participants accepted its terms. Once one member rejected those terms, the structure itself became unstable. Brooklyn's departure represents more than a generational disagreement. It signals a refusal to continue operating within a framework where identity, labor, and family affiliation are inseparable. His claims frame autonomy not as rebellion, but as self-preservation. Whether those claims are ultimately validated or contested, they reflect a broader tension facing families whose private lives are monetized at scale. For David and Victoria Beckham, the implications are equally significant. Their public restraint suggests an awareness that overt confrontation would only escalate the situation. Yet restraint also limits their ability to correct or contextualize allegations that challenge the foundation of their legacy. Silence, once a tool of control, now functions as a vacuum in which alternative narratives gain traction. The long-term consequences are still unclear. The family brand remains financially powerful, but its symbolic value has been altered. Unity was not just an image, it was the central promise of the Beckham story. With that promise broken, the brand must exist without its defining feature. Whether it can adapt to that reality is an open question. There is also the matter of precedent. Brooklyn's actions place the Beckham family within a growing public conversation about adult children severing ties with powerful parents. Legal boundaries, mediated communication, and public statements are increasingly used where private negotiation once prevailed. The Beckham case illustrates how wealth and fame do not insulate families from these dynamics and may in fact intensify them. No definitive outcome has been reached. There is no court ruling, no formal settlement, and no shared statement of understanding. What exists instead is a prolonged standoff, sustained by competing interpretations of the same history. Each side continues forward under a different definition of harm and responsibility. In that sense, the significance of this rupture lies not in any single allegation, but in the collapse of a system that depended on alignment. The Beckham family no longer moves as one entity. The separation appears deliberate, managed, and ongoing. Whether time softens the divide or entrenches it further will depend on factors that extend beyond public image or legal strategy. For now, the story stands as an example of how power, when left unexamined, can become a source of fracture rather than protection. It also underscores how difficult it is to disentangle family from enterprise once the two have been fused. The outcome remains unresolved, but the transformation is already complete.